Hey folks, so it's May 1st, 2018, and there's no better day than this to really kind of get into my explanation of the very confusing political setup of 2018. What does it mean to be a leftist in 2018? What does it mean, right? I consider myself to be a political leftist. I consider myself to be on the left. There's a lot of people that are on the left that really don't agree with me and make a point of reminding me of that constantly. Furthermore, there's a lot of people, that are left that do agree with me, and there's a lot of people on the right that maybe they don't agree with me ideologically, but they tend to agree with a lot of what I say about international events. And there's a lot of people on the left who maybe they, say they believe in socialism like I do, but when it comes to international events, they do not agree with me. When it comes to my analysis of different countries, when it comes to what I think is important, even in domestic issues, they don't agree with me. So what does it mean to be a leftist in 2018? And why is this so confusing? Well, I have worked out a rather complex explanation of this, which I'm going to try to very, very quickly lay on you all, okay? So if you go back 100 years, you go back to the time when Marxism was a pervasive movement in Europe, when you go back to the time when words like socialism were becoming popular, 1800s, even up into 1900, there were basically two psychological makeups between people that were attracted to Marxism, socialism, communism, and what was called leftist political movements. The first political makeup is a kind of a leftist mindset that's always there. No matter where you go in the world, no matter what the economy is like, no matter where it's at, you're going to find this. And this is a middle-class strand. There are people in every society who are from the more middle-class or educated sectors of the society, and they feel that the world that they live in is unjust. They feel like, things are not right. Those in authority are misusing their authority and tyrannical. Those with wealth and power are oppressing those below them. And these younger people who maybe they just don't fit in with society, whatever, they're usually younger, they're usually from some kind of middle class or upper middle class strata. They want to fight against injustice, and they're full of passion and this drive to go out and make a difference in the world and challenge those in power and unleash chaos and demand that things change. And that's a current that's always there, no matter what. That's the first mindset that you find. And Karl Marx himself was from that strata. You look at Trotsky, other figures, this is a current present. There's this revolutionary intelligentsia or middle class element that sees the world as unjust, wants to fight the status quo. Now, the second grouping, you only see this second grouping in times of crisis, but it's far, far bigger. And these are people, ordinary working class people. People, they work a job, they've got a family, they've got kids, they love their country, they love their community. But when there's a crisis in capitalism, and when people can't get jobs, and when there's riots in the streets, and when things are becoming less and less stable, and when there's a war that might happen, and their relatives, they themselves might get drafted to go fight in a war, all of a sudden, they're forced to get political, and they're forced to start thinking about politics, and they're scared, and they're afraid, and in times of crisis, these folks also get attracted to socialist, communist, and left-wing politics. Why? Because the system that they live under is making their lives unpredictable. And unlike that first group, they don't want chaos. They want order. And they see socialism and socialist politics and the promise of a state-run economy and the means of production being controlled by society as a way to get out of the madness. They say, look, socialism can make it so I can have a job, I can eat, I don't have to be afraid of these big wars, we can take care of people. What they want out of socialism is completely different than what that first group wants. And these two groups, while they might overall have the same narrative, that somebody else has the power, that those who own the major centers of economic power, own the means of production, are oppressing and us, and we should rise up and take control of them, while they have the same overall narrative in their leftist views and their leftist mindset, what they really want and what they aspire to create is very, very different. One group aspires to create mass chaos, just let the world ring. It's kind of, you think about William Blake, and he wrote, my sword shall not sleep in my hand until we have built Jerusalem. They're going to keep fighting and tearing things down and creating chaos until they've created utopia. The second group wants their lives to be normal. They're saying capitalism is making our lives unsustainable. There's a group of very rich and powerful people that are just making our lives unlivable. We want action. We want the government. We want some kind of revolutionary action to take place so that we can go back to living a normal life. These are two different mindsets. And if you look at the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Party was primarily made up of that first group of people from the intelligentsia, the middle class, even some children of the nobility, who were attracted to these revolutionary ideas. They had this burning anger and frustration with society, and so they turned to radical ideas. But Lenin had the brilliance to kind of control these alienated upper-class children that were striving for chaos and revolution and adventure. And he was able to kind of control them and get them to act in a way that with their action, they could harness the energy of this other group, right? If you look at the Russian Revolution, it wasn't made on the slogan of, fight and die for pure communism. No, the Russian Revolution was about peace, land, and bread. It was basically, a very, very mass program. Everyone knew the Bolsheviks as that they were the party that wanted to end World War I. If you wanted World War I to end, you were with the Bolsheviks. They were the anti-war guys. That's what everyone knew them as. Peace, land, and bread, the Bolshevik, the majority party. They were just the anti-war party. Even though it was made up of that first group that strove for the chaos, Lenin had the tactical brilliance to organize them in a way that they could harness the energy of that first group. And so the Russian Revolution, we saw these two souls, these two energies within socialism combining in order to take power and create the Soviet Union. But almost immediately after the Russian Revolution, you see these two groups separating from each other, right? You have Trotsky. This is a guy who spent most of his life in exile from an upper middle class family. He writes about permanent revolution. He wants the Soviet Union to just be a temporary holdout in the global class struggle. He wants the Soviet Union to just be funding revolutionaries around the world and militarize itself. You see Trotsky getting kicked out, and then Stalin, somebody who's from the peasant class. He's from a peasant family. His father's a bootmaker, so technically a worker. He's got some education. He's gone to preschool, but he's a working class guy, an organizer. He's the editor of Pravda, the daily agitational newspaper. You see Stalin become the leader of the Soviet Union. And you see the politics of the Communist International change. The Communist International and the Comintern is not a party that's, it's not a group that's going around urging people to take up arms and revolution again. No, it's a group that's fighting for working people. They organize the unemployment councils, and the World Communist Movement very much becomes, a wing of the politics, not of this first group that's striving for revolution and chaos and destruction, but really the politics of this second group, of Stalin, a guy from the working class, of, unemployment councils, trade unions. The communists were known as the party that would fight for bread, and they eventually organize a popular front, and when they align with various anti-capitalist and anti-fascist forces, even some capitalist forces that are anti-fascist, and build kind of a block against fascism. And the Soviet Union very much becomes, really solidly in the camp of this first trend. Then, after the Second World War, you start to, there's a lot of communists around the world who were attracted to the Soviet Union, perhaps. They consider themselves communists, but they don't like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is too conservative. The Soviet Union is glorifying the Soviet family. They've outlawed abortion. They've outlawed homosexuality. The Soviet Union, they see it as just kind of a stagnant place. And sure, maybe the banks, factories, and industries are run by the people, but it's just not the revolutionary utopia that these middle-class intellectuals, that first group, want around the world. So increasingly, they cut themselves off from the Soviet Union. They start saying that we're leftists, but we're not like these evil Soviets, these Stalinists. We're Trotskyists, we're anarchists. We're anti-authoritarians. We're the new left. And you start seeing that first trend completely break itself off from the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, you start seeing the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency start funnel money to this group with the Partisan Review magazine and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And increasingly, you see figures like Brzezinski, who figure out that kind of manipulating these revolutionary intellectuals is an effective way of fighting the Soviet Union and fighting socialism and communism. And eventually, all across Eastern Europe, you have the color revolutions, which are mainly led by the children of the intellectuals, the privileged people in Soviet society, university students who were mad at the Soviet Union, not because they didn't have food or not because they didn't have jobs, but because they didn't have Beatles music and they didn't have freedom of speech and they didn't have, the kind of freedom that you saw in the West. And so they had this rage against Marxist-Leninist governments, and they probably thought of themselves as left. They didn't say they believed in imperialism and capitalism, but they were kind of hijacked. And so, meanwhile, then, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, you have socialist governments around the world. You have the People's Republic of China. You've got Vietnam. And you also have, Baath socialism, which came into existence as a result of the Soviet Union. This is not Marxist socialism, but it's, Baathist Arab socialism, like in Syria and Iraq. And increasingly, these state-run economies, that came into existence mainly because the Soviet Union existed. There would have been no one for them to trade with. There would have been no one to kind of back them up against the United States. But around the world, you see in the Arab world, in China, in different parts of the world, you see these socialist governments that have come into power, and they're facing attack from the West. And that first group, that very radical middle class that longs for chaos, has essentially been co-opted and hijacked by imperialism. So what does this second group do? These socialist governments, these state-run planned economies, they become increasingly socially conservative because that's what they can offer to their populations. They can offer them stability. They can say, look, in the capitalist world, people are losing their jobs, they're starving on the streets, but we can offer you stability. We can offer you a world where you can wake up in the morning and have a job and have guaranteed education and a decent life. And increasingly, they become more and more socially conservative, and they emphasize the fact that they don't tolerate homosexuality and that they have a conservative view of the world and that they're defenders of the traditional family. So the left, over the course of the 20th century, got pulled apart. These two distinct psychologies, these two energies within socialism have been pulled apart. The middle class longing for justice wing has basically been co-opted by imperialism. And the broader wing, the populism, the working class people who just want their lives to be normal and want the state to intervene and control the economy to give them better lives, they've become conservative. They don't call themselves left anymore. So that's why it's so confusing. In Syria, for example, that's a socialist government, the Baath Arab socialist government. They're leftists, but they don't frame their views in terms of Marxism. In fact, they present themselves to their population as defenders of stability and as conservatives. Meanwhile, you have leftists all over the West that want nothing to do with governments like Syria, and instead, their issues that they care about are transgender bathrooms. It's getting university professors fired for racially insensitive statements they make. It's the left wants nothing to do with the banks, factories, and industries being run by the people. Workers control the means of production. Outside from a few Marxist sects, you don't even find that in left-wing circles. The left are people that just are angry about injustice and they want to tear things down, and they want to punish people who break a set of, socially, politically correct rules. They're really not concerned about Marxism. So that's the situation we're in, that the two energies within leftism, these two distinct energies that were kind of unified and especially cemented together by the Bolshevik Revolution, have been pulled apart. That's the situation we're in. And so then the question becomes, what do we do now? And in the United States, my position is what we need more than ever is we need some form of constructive socialism in the United States. We need a left-sounding or Marxist-sounding message that doesn't tell working people that they're going to make their lives chaotic, that doesn't say we're going to try to strive for some kind of violent revolution, but rather says, look, we want to fight for working people. We want a government of action that works on behalf of working families. We need, those politics that came to dominate the Communist International in the 1930s, where the communists were organizing unemployment councils and feeding people and taking care of people and organizing them and telling them that they were striving to build a society where the workers owned the factories and that there wasn't exploitation and that the major centers of economic power, the banks, factories, major industries were under the control of the people. Building a community-wide movement based on those principles, that's what's drastically needed. And that the chaotic left has been co-opted, and increasingly socialist governments around the world don't present themselves in a left-wing manner. What needs to be done is there needs to be that working class people in the United States who are losing their homes, losing their jobs, need to come to understand this isn't because of immigrants, it's not because of liberals, it's because of capitalism. It's because we have an economy centered around making profits for a small group of people. And that if you really love your community, if you really love your country, if you want to bring peace to the society you live in, you want to bring stability, the way to do that is to challenge the power of the billionaire Wall Street financial elite. You think about Huey Long. Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana back in the 1800s, or not in the 1800s, I'm sorry, the governor of Louisiana during the 1930s. He talked about every man a king. And he said, if you want to be a millionaire, that's great, but we need to make the economy function so that every American has a chance. And he basically started controlling the oil industry. And if you look at, Huey Long is still widely loved in Louisiana. There's statues of him, there's bridges that he built. Huey Long was a populist. And actually, Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panthers, was actually named after Huey Long, because even though they had Jim Crow in Louisiana at that time, Huey Long was so loved by the African American community because of the levels of economic justice that he fought for. There are a lot of African Americans that were big supporters of Huey Long, and Huey P. Newton, the founder of the Panthers, is actually named after him. So, we need populism in the United States. We need people appealing to the working class. We need people talking about a government of action that'll fight for working families and fight against injustice. As long as the left in the United States is associated with chaos and destruction, people aren't going to go for it. People want their lives to get better. They don't want them to get worse in order to fulfill some kind of juvenile, middle-class, childish fantasy. That's not what working people are going to go for. The socialism that we need in the United States right now is a constructive socialism. We need to tell people in the United States that socialism will make your lives better, and that it's capitalism that is causing so much misery and insecurity.